Hi everyone, welcome to your first lecture in social media law and risk management on global legal systems and laws affecting social media. It's Module 1, Lecture 2, because our first was of course the course introduction. Now today we're working fairly closely to the textbook, blogging and tweeting without getting sued, and that's what we'll do in most of the lectures. Bear in mind the lectures can't cover everything. The best way they've found educationally to deliver a video is in keeping it less than about 20 minutes. You've all seen TED Talks, I hope, and you know that that formula really works. So the 1 to 2 hour lectures don't work anymore, and that's why we're doing it in these shorter bursts, but you will need to look for the detail to your textbook and other readings that are provided. We can only skim over them here. A touchstone, just introduce them to you. What are we covering today? Well, you'll get a familiar pattern feeding through the lectures as we go through the semester. We start with a practice learning problem, and I'll read that out to you. We position that learning problem. We look at the key principles of the area of law that we're dealing with. In this week, we're looking at older laws and how well they fit or are a misfit with Web 2. We're covering a few legal basics. Some of you may have studied some law before. Others are graduates of other disciplines, so you do need to cover the legal basics. And we look at some social media laws and issues that arise in the context of those laws. We then move to discussion questions. And these discussion questions are what you can talk about on the discussion board. You can write a bit about them in your learning journals. The important thing, though, is that they get you thinking, and it's a very important study tool to sit there, think, take a few notes as your own response to the discussion questions as they arise. One small point, and it's related to small points, and that is if you're just watching the video, despite the excellent efforts of our production staff, whatever your format or your bandwidth might prevent you reading some of the smaller words on the screen as the slide arises. Don't worry about that. The PowerPoint slides are also sitting there on the content areas of Learning at Griffith, so you'll be able to go and look on PowerPoint yourself at the slides later. So let's look at a practice learning problem where you'll be going to the discussion board and to the forum and sharing your ideas with your colleagues about this one. It's called the Government PR Person and the Anti-Policy Tweets. So you're employed in a government environment department as a media communications officer. And you know a colleague who is employed at the same level as you is highly opinionated against the current government's policies. A friend brings this to your attention. The fact that the colleague has been tweeting highly critical messages opposing the government's shark netting policies to the Twitter handle @EcoWarrior. So let's look at the sort of questions that we will be asking in these learning problems. What are the key legal issues that you think are arising here? What does the textbook say about the key elements of those areas of media law? Who might be liable legally? What defences might apply in this situation? What similar cases can you find that might provide guidance to you? What courts might have jurisdiction or power to hear this matter? How might your situation differ if you were in a different country? How might stakeholder theory inform our understanding of this situation and help us analyse the problem? What risks or legal consequences arise for the publisher, the organisation, and these main stakeholders? What course of action should you take and why? What aspects of social media policy might address these issues as they arise here? And how might they be best worded if they were in a social media policy? You can see that all of the elements come together in this set of questions. You won't be able to answer some of them deeply, and on some problems you'll answer them more deeply than others. So go to the discussion board and talk about these. You might find some guidance on this one though, and you could read your first legal case, the case of Banerjee against Bowles. Banerjee v Bowles from 2013, which has some similar facts going on there with certain consequences for the government officer who was engaged in Twitter. There's also an ABC Law Report episode devoted to that issue of workplace tweeting. And as extension, some of you might want to listen to that 30-minute podcast from the Law Report. All right, well, let's get into, in our final few minutes, we'll get into some of those issues to do with social media and the legal system. So why do we start with these first key principles? Well, Web 2 is certainly a wonderful innovation, but there are risks attached, particularly for those who are ignorant of the law. With global communication like Web 2, we are now publishing into many different nations, states, territories, known as jurisdictions in legal terms. Whereas in the old days, we used to be pretty much confined to the one place where we lived. So now the laws of all of these other jurisdictions come into play. And legally, we are all now publishers. Using social media, it might be a flippant little tweet or a Facebook posting or a little Instagram photo that you're sending off, but you're actually publishing that in the eyes of the law. And above all, we need to learn when to ring the alarm bells to seek legal advice. This course doesn't train you to be a lawyer in the area. What it should be training you to do is giving you enough of an understanding to know when you might be entering a legal problem area where you need to then call for legal advice. Now, that was the sort of situation that's highlighted in your textbook example of the Alison Cheng case. Now, I'm not going to repeat all of the details. The basic point was that here was a girl on a Christian youth camp, and the leader of the camp took a photo, posted it to Flickr, and somebody on the other side of the world in Australia, in the Virgin Mobile Company, saw that it was on Flickr. What a great photo of a girl holding her fingers in a V shape. That would match the Virgin campaign. And they grabbed it and they used it, and it finished up on bus stops and the back of buses around Australia, all without the permission of the person who'd taken the photograph and without the permission of the teenager who lived in Texas in the United States. As the book explains, it raised a whole lot of different issues in different jurisdictions to do with different laws. Laws like defamation, breach of copyright, confidentiality, privacy. So it's a good starting point to see that all of these laws can come into play with a single social media posting. Ancient laws for a digital era. Well, the law is not the fastest moving beast, and it's been developed over centuries, in some countries, over hundreds and hundreds of years. And century-old laws aren't developed for modern communications, crossing the boundaries of states, territories and nations. So the law is having to catch up very quickly. I talk in the text about the long arm of cyber law. And one example I give is actually an Australian High Court case from 2002, Dow Jones against Gutnick. It was a very important international case because it decided that, at least in defamation terms, material was considered published in the eyes of the law wherever it was downloaded. And in this case, it was an Australian litigant who was suing over material that had been published from New Jersey in the United States, but he was allowed to sue for defamation in Victoria in Australia because that's where people had downloaded the material that would damage his reputation. So that's very interesting to bear in mind because there can be legal consequences for us elsewhere for what we post on social media. You need to understand some legal basics, which we really can't do justice to here, but some important ones are the sources of law, basically where law comes from, And it essentially comes from normally either legislation, laws passed in Parliament, or from case law, decisions made by the higher courts in a particular jurisdiction. Now, your country's legal system will give higher courts, sometimes they're called a high court, other times a court of appeal, a Supreme Court, will give these courts powers to hear appeals from lower courts in the land. And they are the decisions that will normally hold weight, be more persuasive in this what's called a doctrine of precedent, where precedents, earlier cases, have a play on future cases and on the interpretation of laws. The other big thing is that some of the social media laws we talk about during the course fall within what we call the general criminal law. These are actually offences, really bad things people can do on social media that are criminal offences where people who post them could be fined or jailed. The other sort of law that gets invoked is, of course, civil law, where people sue each other for damages. A good example of that is defamation. If you damage my reputation, I could take you to court to sue you for an award of damages, or perhaps for an injunction, a court order to stop you publishing that sort of material in the future. The key laws affecting social media that we'll be looking at in the course are the laws of defamation, copyright, confidentiality, privacy, hate speech, national security laws, and contempt of court. They raise a whole host of issues that we'll be looking at along the way. This issue of jurisdiction, where something is published, who can sue, the liability of hosts, social media platforms and internet service providers, your own liability, the timing of social media and how that might affect the law, the issue of the public interest or matters of public concern and how that plays in, US First Amendment or free expression principles and similar approaches in other countries, and the idea of malice, vindictive material, cyberbullying and trolling, and the different risks that might apply to different social media types. So we've covered a few things today, and it raises several questions. Consider your own country's legal system and the way it operates. Does your constitution protect free expression? The Constitution, as far as legislation goes, is the preeminent document from which all other rules and laws and systems are drawn. So if it protects free expression, that could affect the way you're able to use social media. What's your court structure? And what's the hierarchy of the courts? Which ones are the courts of appeal? What sort of social media risks, particularly legal risks, arise in your own organisation? Whether that's a workplace, perhaps you're a university student, what about within the context of a university? Or maybe you're a member of a sporting club. What are the social media risks attached to that? Any organisation will do for the purposes of that discussion. Have you encountered some social media yourself, social media behaviour that might have had a legal risk attached? Perhaps you've done something yourself that you think now, on reflection, might have gotten you into trouble legally. Well, please jump onto that discussion board and talk about these things and note them down in your learning journal. At the end of the semester, you won't use everything in your learning journal. You'll need to do some pretty severe editing. But it's a good place to be going there now and reflecting upon these things. So where have we been today? We've been there. We've only just spoken about them. We've looked at the key legal principles and laws, some of the main legal terms we'll be using. We flagged some of the biggest areas of legal risk and whether or not we're publishers. Where we're heading, well, next week we'll be exploring stakeholder theory, that theory that's underpinning the course, and you'll need to read the 2 articles that we've listed there as preparation. Meanwhile, introduce yourself on the discussion board and engage on some of the key topics that have been raised this week. I'll see you on the discussion board. Bye for now.